Hey everybody, good to see you. I just wanted to go over the chapter that I missed. I should say the group hangout that I missed. I really wish I didn't miss it. It was on chapter 9 and 11. It looked really great. As far as the book was concerned and the what was covered in the text, it was one of those things where it's like, man, it's just the subject that I love, which is really ethics in leadership. I think is something that's really not covered enough. What I loved about the book, and I'll talk a little bit about also too how the group covered this subject. But what I liked about this, in this text so much, what I really cared about was, what impressed me was I talked about this in our first hangout. Was the first chapter gets into leadership or the evils of leadership, which I think is really great because it comes down to, when you see that type of behavior, it comes down to a lack of ethics. That's when we see a breakdown in leadership and behaviors. And then we see, of course, failures in leadership and management as a result of the lack of ethics. I think, Michael in the actual get together pointed out some very, very good examples of leadership that he saw, in his experience. And also to the other members like Lacey and of course Carrie, I felt like they shared other examples of things that they saw, and this is interesting because, again, I think what you have to see in your experience in leadership is it's important to see good examples of leadership, but what quite often happens, and I don't know if people really realize this, you see more examples of poor leadership than good leadership, and you have to really you have to learn from both. You have to glean upon the good, and you have to learn from both. And back to the book, really what was interesting was the take on Immanuel Kant to bring him into this and his viewpoint on, I should say, his philosophy on, categorical, the categorical philosophy of meaning without exception. I just thought was very impressive to see and hear that. And of course, it gets into a little bit about the utilitarianism aspect of philosophy running into leadership ethics. So I think this is important, again, because when you get into it, there's a much deeper perspective of what leadership should be from an ethical perspective, what is important as far as the components of leadership, such as like moral judgment, and again, moral sensitivity, being able to recognize these things. And of course, moral character and then moral motivation. All these things are so important when dealing with leadership. Now, this leads really into, chapter 11, and we're talking about chapter 9. In chapter 9, flowing backwards into that and looking at it in, leading in politics and leading public leadership. I think some of the problems we see now and are seeing in this election cycle and have seen in the past have been a result or a lack of ethics, really walking the walk and, with what you speak and talk. And so as a result of that, I think we see problems because people want to please everybody, but they don't want to do the right thing. And as a result, it comes to breakdowns of moral leadership, of ethics. I know that we expect a lot of our leaders that in some ways we want them to be canonized, in real terms, people are humans and they make mistakes. And even in the past, they make mistakes as well. But what I would say to that is that you have to make the right decision at the right time for the right thing, to do that right thing. And I think if you have good ethics, what you believe in and what you believe in is the right thing to do, so that we take care of people. I think as a public steward, you'll end up doing the right thing and really making sure that, again, politicians and public leaders serve people. They don't serve lobbyists or organizations or, for that matter, donors. They serve the people that vote them into office. And I think if you have that as a background and you have good ethics, the rest will come into play as far as what's concerned, rather than doing guilt by omission, hiding things, not coming forward with the truth. So that's my take on the chapter, and of course on the group study. What I saw, I'm sorry I missed it, because again, I love this book from the text as to what it brings. I've learned something from it. It was neat to see, again, going back, I know we didn't read chapter 1 this time, but in the introduction of chapter 1, a long time ago, I'd outlined a book that I wanted to write. I've written articles for different magazines over the years, but one of the things I wanted to do was a book called The Evils of Leadership. and really kind of get into these things because I've had some bad experiences in working at corporations, and to really highlight that because I don't see that much. But I think this text really motivated me to kind of highlight and revisit that. And this is interesting because, again, it gets into that list at the beginning, and it gets into this, chapter 11 as far as ethical leadership is concerned. And somebody was talking to me. He's like, "Oh, you want to write something like, the 9 circles of management," going off of the allegory of Dante Alighieri, talking about his descent with the poet Virgil going into hell. But I just thought that was interesting, again, because they tell you all the things that people did wrong as you enter the 9 concentric circles. And I thought that's the same thing with ethics and leadership and management, right? These things that you do, they could be little, but they have a big effect, over people in their lives. And when you get down to it, and you get into areas like deceit, greed, and treachery, you get into areas where, like, Bernie Madoff, for example, who in his want for greed, in his treachery for deceit, what he did was basically he impoverished so many people who relied on him, much like Ponzi did in the early 1900s, of taking away retirement from people. So I think, again, it's the lack of ethics that really caused great failure with people. So that's my take. I'm sorry I went over time. This kind of stuff excites me. I'm thankful for this text and for all the learnings in this particular week of the class. Thank you very much, and hope to talk to you soon.